to hospital with breathing difficulties, could have survived if he hadn't been neglected by medical staff. The row between the neighbours has been escalating. It began last week in Brussels when President Sarkozy appeared to brush off David Cameron as the Prime Minister tried to shake hands. Yesterday, the chairman of France's central bank suggested the UK's credit rating should be downgraded ahead of that of his own country. Today, the French finance minister, François Baroin, weighed in.
We
don't like giving lectures, and we don't like receiving lectures, although we have been receiving a few. It's true that the economic situation in Great Britain is very preoccupying. One prefers to be French than British at the moment on a financial level.
All very undiplomatic. Well, today, in what one can only assume was a frosty phone call, Nick Clegg told the French Prime Minister, François Fillon, that such remarks from members of the French government were simply unacceptable. Mr Clegg said that steps should be taken to calm the rhetoric. Well, on the line now is the MEP Edward McMillan-Scott. He was a Conservative MEP but moved to the LibDems in 2010 and is now a Vice President of the European Parliament. Good evening, Edward McMillan-Scott.
Good evening.
If the French were hoping to win over the British, they haven't exactly put on a charm offensive this week, have they?
Well, it started actually with George Osborne making rather ridiculous remarks about Sarkozy's height, and earlier this year, David Cameron attacking the euro, so much so that he was criticised by Nicolas Sarkozy some months ago, actually. So it's not really the French who started it, if you want to call this a dispute.
But that's the point, isn't it? Friday's events were seen to be a turning point. And actually, if all the countries in Europe are serious about making progress to resolving the crisis, surely now is the moment to try and build bridges, to put in diplomatic capital and actually bring people together rather than carping in this way.
I think it's important that we talk to each other within the United Kingdom about our future in Europe, especially. But at the same time, there's no point in, as you say, name-calling across the channel. And I think Nick Clegg, who at least speaks the same language as the French Prime Minister, David Cameron, as far as I'm aware, has no language skills and doesn't really understand the continental part of the continent of Europe. And so I think Nick actually is doing a good job. But at the same time, he's loyal to the government. We're trying to control our economy in this country. It is perfectly true we have a higher inflation, lower growth and a worse deficit than France, but their banks are very heavily indebted, especially to countries like Greece, and that is their problem. That's why last week it was Standard & Poor's making adverse comments about the European governments, and this week it's Fitch's.
But if the point is ultimately to solve the crisis, actually everybody needs to work together, and it's a message that Germany seems to have taken home, because actually they've been rather positive and encouraging British inclusion in the talks over the past week, and yet France hasn't been able to put on such a positive front.
Well, I think the Germans are very good at diplomacy, and I think the fact that David Cameron walked away from the table last Friday did cause a lot of deep unease within the Eurozone.
But it's very easy to portray David Cameron as a single isolated figure within all of this, but actually every country within Europe has its no-go areas. You could say that France has the CAP, Spain has its fishing rights. David Cameron isn't alone in actually saying, these are our boundaries, we won't go any further than this.
Sorry, but what people are concerned about is that David Cameron's decision to walk away from a treaty with apparently the intention of protecting the city did exactly the opposite. And city figures are now saying, and business figures in the UK, what on earth was he about? It was a most bizarre decision, unless the intention was to have a sort of Union Jack election, ditch the coalition, and start again with what he would perceive as a big majority. I mean, if one's cynical about it, that may well be the case. But as far as the markets are concerned, as far as the Eurozone is concerned, we all have an interest in stability. And David Cameron deeply undermined the Eurozone itself. Okay. And we're not in the euro, but the fact is it matters deeply to us and 3.5 million people who work in this country.
Edward McMillan-Scott, thank you very much. Well, in an interview this week, President Sarkozy